Hello, welcome to Philosophy 101 at Honolulu Community College. This is Program 2, Inadequate Answers, and I am Chris Ann Moore. By now you should have seen Program 1. You should have gone through your syllabus carefully and slowly. Now you know all the procedures for the course and all your requirements. You should have also read Why Study Philosophy, your first chapter, and answered the study questions at the end of that chapter. And finally, you should have emailed me and told me which door would you pass through. So, now that you know what we covered in Section 1, you know that philosophy is the love of wisdom. Wisdom, of course, is the knowledge of how to live the best of all possible lives and being able to live it consistently. As we saw last time, once we ask ourselves what wisdom is, once we begin on this search for the best of all possible lives and the ability to live it, all sorts of questions spill out. Is there meaning and purpose to my life? Does a divine being exist? Is there life after death? We will only be dealing with a small portion of those questions in this class. Those are the questions of morality. Morality deals with correct behavior to other beings. And of course, in examining morality, we will be looking at ethics, which is how we make moral choices. That is the reasoning behind our moral choices. Now, as we saw last time, in all these questions, in all these moral questions, there is no definitive answer. In other words, out of all the time that philosophy has been studied, out of all the time that people have searched for wisdom, there are no answers that can be absolutely proven to be true. But of course, this is a wonderful thing. Because of that uncertainty, that allows for you to find your own answers. That allows you to strive and struggle for what you believe in. That allows for free will, and it allows for individuation. It allows for that conscious, creative confrontation with the mystery of life, which is really the essence of life itself. But although there are no definitive answers to philosophical questions, some answers are better than others. You see, philosophers may disagree on the specific answer to a question, but for the most part, they agree on those methods that lead to answers that are worth considering. Some answers are just plain wrong, because they do not lead to the best of all possible lives. Of course, since we are looking for the best of all possible lives, we want the best of all possible answers. And morality is essential to who we are. It is essential to our character. It is essential to whether we are able to live the best of all possible lives. It is essential to our happiness. Morality is, in essence, a pursuit of happiness. That is not to say that morality is selfish, as we saw last time. Morality is instead in our self-interest. This has been shown by philosophers all over time. And since it is in our self-interest, and since it is part of our pursuit of happiness, we do want to come up with the best of all possible answers. So what we're going to do in this episode, in this beginning to search for the best of all possible answers, the first thing we're going to look at is those answers that are considered inadequate, those answers that are insufficient for philosophical reasoning. And so in order to do that, I want us to look at our first case. This is the case of Kalani and Malia. Okay, Kalani and Malia are both 18. They're community college students. They're good friends. They also enjoy having sex. In other words, they have a sexual relationship. They decide to split rent on an apartment and live together, and they agree to no commitment. Either can end the relationship whenever. So what I want you to ask yourself is this question. Is Kalani and Malia's decision moral, immoral, or non-moral? And I want you to ask this question according to your personal morality. So think about it. Moral, immoral, or non-moral? Well, of course, as we saw in the last episode, in philosophy, we have to be very careful that we have our terms correct. So why don't we look at the definitions of some of these terms? First of all, what is moral? Well, moral means good or right in conduct or character. When you are moral, you are acting in accordance with the principles of right or good behavior. Okay, what's immoral? Immoral is wrong or bad in conduct and character. In other words, actions that are contrary to the principles of right conduct or good behavior. And then, of course, there is one more issue, one more term, non-moral, which simply means it's not a moral issue. Obviously, not everything is a moral issue. It's not a moral issue that I decide to wear purple today. It's where I'm going to go to dinner tonight is not a moral issue. So it is up for you. It's up to you to decide. Is Kalani and Malia's behavior, their agreement to split rent on an apartment and live together with no commitment because they are good friends and enjoy having a sexual relationship, moral, immoral, or non-moral? However, as you're thinking about that, I want to give you the definition of one more term, because this is a term some people confuse with issues of morality. And that term is, of course, manners. You see, manners also deal with correct behavior. However, usually with issues of less consequence than those that morals address. For example, if I take my shoes off before I enter your house, for some people that would be an issue of manners, and for other people, that would be a moral issue. So manners and morality can become confused sometimes. However, basically, manners deal with issues of less consequence than those that morals deal with. Manners usually deal with issues of taste, whereas morals deal with issues of ultimate value. Okay, so now that you know what moral, immoral, non-moral, and manners are, what did you choose? Well, I can tell you I've given this exercise to numerous students, and there are all sorts of answers. I have heard that Kalani and Malia's decision is perfectly moral, that they're consenting adults, and therefore it is their decision. I've also heard that it is a non-moral issue for that reason. It is simply a decision that two adults are making. Of course, I've heard it's immoral. Some people believe that Kalani and Malia's decision is immoral because they apparently have no commitment. Some people believe that the morality of sexuality is dependent on commitment. For some people, that commitment is a long-term relationship. For other people, that commitment is marriage. But whatever you believe, whatever your moral decision was, now I want you to ask yourself what is really important. Here's the very important question. Did you choose the same answer as your parents would have? Think about that for a second. Did you choose the same answer as your parents would have? Okay. Now, I have taught this course for a very long time, and I can tell you that the vast majority of my students do not give the same answer as their parents would have. But let's ask one more question. For those of you who did give the same answer as your parents would have, because I do have students who have the same answer as your parents, ask yourself this question. Did you give the same reasons your parents would have? In other words, if you came up with the same answer, did you come up with the same answer for the same reasons? Now, this can be best illustrated by an example. For instance, perhaps you thought Kalani and Malia's relationship was immoral, that their decision to live together was immoral, but you thought so because there's a lack of responsibility. For instance, there's no indication that they've discussed the possibility of pregnancy. Now, we all know not every method of birth control is completely effective. There is always a chance you can have a baby. There's no indication that they've even thought about that. So perhaps you thought it was immoral for that reason. But perhaps your parents thought it was immoral based on their religion. Thus, your moral determination in both cases was immoral. But your reasons were different. One being responsibility, the other being religion. Why is this important? This is extremely important because you need to realize that you don't always agree with your parents. Think about that. Even those of you who had the same answer for the same reasons as your parents, if you look over your life and your decisions, you will find that you do not agree with your parents 100% of the time. The fact is, you're college students now. That means you're all adults. You have your own experiences, you have your own ideas, and you have your own reasons. And because of those, you have begun to develop your own morality. This leads us to our first inadequate answer. An inadequate answer, when asked for the reason for a moral decision, is I was raised that way. Inadequate answer. I was raised that way. some simple facts. You don't always agree with your parents. If I was raised that way was a sufficient reason for a moral decision, you would always agree with your parents. But you don't. So when someone says the reason they believe something was because they were raised that way, that is equivalent to saying, I believe it because I was told to believe it. That's not a real reason. Now, of course, you may agree with your parents, but if you do so, you have reasons for doing so. In addition, you may disagree with your parents, and if you do so, you should have reason for doing so. I know this may be shocking to you, some of you, but parents can be wrong. The fact is that many parents are not aware of their own ethical reasoning. In fact, some of them have never even thought of the question. They haven't been in a philosophy class, and therefore they have not been asked to give reason or defense for their moral decisions. Why is this? Well, most of us are taught ethics when we're about 2 years old. And when you're 2 years old, you're just told something is right or wrong. And when the 2-year-old says, why? You don't sit there and have a philosophical discussion with a 2-year-old. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? And so, when you're 2, I told you so is a good answer. And some people never move on from there. They just accept what they were told as they were raised and never question it. Or, when they're teenagers, they just throw it out, but never do so after reasoning. So now you're adults. You have your own experiences, you have your own reasons. If you choose to agree with your parents, that's great. If you choose not to agree with your parents, that's great. In either case, in philosophy, what is important is that you are able to give the reasons behind your decision. So, once again, when you do agree with your parents, you have your own reason. Some more simple facts. As an adult, it is time to choose when and why you agree with your parents or not. When someone says, I was raised that way, it is an excuse not to do your own thinking and reasoning. The fact is, we want to strive and struggle for our own answers, but sometimes we just get lazy. Sometimes we don't want to do our own thinking. And when someone says, I was raised that way, it's lazy. It's an excuse not to do your own thinking. So this is our first inadequate answer, not to be used in this class. I was raised that way is not a reason for morality. Okay, let's look at our second inadequate answer. Another answer that is inadequate reasoning in philosophy is, it is my tradition. Yes, some of us have developed our morals and our ethics within a cultural tradition. But the truth is, just because something is a tradition is not a reason to continue doing it. Let's look at this. Let's look at some traditions, some more simple facts. Slavery was a tradition. Denying women education and the vote was a tradition. And foot binding was a tradition. Some of you might not know what foot binding is. Foot binding was a tradition in China. They believed that women with small feet were more attractive. It also prevented women from running away. What they would do is, at a very early age, they would begin to bind the toes towards the heel, and they would wrap tightly, so that as the girl child grew, her feet would become deformed, small, but not functional. Incredibly painful and incapacitating. That was a tradition. Slavery was not right because it was a tradition. That's not a reason to continue slavery. Denying women education and the vote was not right. It's not a reason, just because it was a tradition, is not a reason to continue it. Foot binding was a tradition. That is not a reason to continue doing it. So it should be clear. Human sacrifice was a tradition. That doesn't mean we should do human sacrifice. So, the truth is, some traditions are wonderful. Some traditions should be preserved. Education. Education is a tradition that should be preserved. But there are reasons why education should be preserved. The Hawaiian hula It is a beautiful and meaningful tradition, and it should be preserved. But it should be preserved not because it's a tradition alone, but because there are beautiful reasons behind preserving that tradition. So, some traditions should be discontinued. Some traditions should be continued. How do we tell the difference between the two? Reasoning. So therefore, it is my tradition is not an answer for a moral decision. It is not philosophical reasoning. If you agree with a tradition and think it should be preserved, you must give reasons why. If you disagree with a tradition and think it should be discontinued, you must give reasons why. Okay, let's look at another inadequate answer. It is the law. I know this might be so hard for some of you to believe, but the truth is, legality is not morality. Let me say that again. Legality is not morality. Simple facts. Let's look at some simple facts about legality. Some laws are immoral. If you look at all the laws, the civil laws in the United States right now, I am sure that you would find that there are some laws that you disagree with. There are some laws that you think are immoral. Some things are illegal, which you believe are perfectly moral. Some things are legal, which you believe are immoral. In addition, there are things that are immoral that the law would never deal with. For instance, there is not a law against lying, although some of you will believe that lying is immoral. There's not a law against adultery. If you found out your partner's cheating on you, you can't call up the police and say, "Hi, I got a cheating mate," because there's no law on that. Legality and morality are separate things. In addition to that, not only are some laws immoral, but reformers have called on moral law to change civil law. In other words, when reformers have believed that civil law was immoral, they have called on moral law as a reason to change civil law. For example, Martin Luther King. When Martin Luther King was fighting for civil rights in the 1960s, the civil laws on the books in the United States segregated black people and people of color from white people. Martin Luther King determined that those laws were immoral. As a matter of fact, in protest against those laws, in acts of nonviolent disobedience, Martin Luther King broke the civil laws. He broke the civil laws because they were immoral according to a higher moral law that Martin Luther King called upon. Similarly, when Rosa Parks refused to sit on the back of the bus and really began the demonstrations of the civil rights movement, she did so because she believed those laws were immoral. As a matter of fact, because Martin Luther King broke civil laws in his protests against segregation, he lost the support of some white ministers and some black Southern ministers as well. When Martin Luther King was in jail, he wrote a letter, a very famous letter called The Letter from Birmingham Jail. It is one of the most moving documents of civil rights history. In The Letter from Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King says, when the civil laws break the higher moral laws, it is our obligation to break the civil laws. It is our obligation to follow the higher moral law and not the civil law. Martin Luther King is only one of many reformers who have taken this position. Another one that we'll talk about is Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, famous for writing on Walden Pond and other books, lived in the first part of the 19th century in Massachusetts. Now, at this time, slavery was legal in the United States. As a matter of fact, there were about 4 million slaves in America, the vast majority of them in the southern states. Well, many Americans were against slavery. These were called abolitionists. And the abolitionists created an underground railroad. This was a series of stops where slaves escaping from the South could find shelter and aid as they were moving north. Well, in 1850, Massachusetts, where Henry David Thoreau lived, passed the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law said that anyone who knew of a runaway slave was obligated to return that slave to his or her owner in the South. The Fugitive Slave Law aimed at destroying the Underground Railroad and would obligate citizens who did not believe in slavery to return human beings to the people who thought they owned them. Henry David Thoreau found this abhorrent. But Henry David Thoreau didn't just sit at home and say nothing. Henry David Thoreau refused to pay his taxes. And he didn't do so quietly. Henry David Thoreau went to the middle of town, and in the middle of the town square said, "I will not give my money to a government whose civil laws break a higher moral law." And Henry David Thoreau ended up in jail. Again and again, reformers have spoken out against civil law, and they've called on moral law in order to do so. A few other examples: Nelson Mandela in his fight against apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was a strict government policy, supported by civil law, of strict segregation and racial discrimination against all non-whites. Nelson Mandela spent 20 years in prison for his actions to break apart apartheid, but he eventually was victorious. Mahatma Gandhi broke the laws of the British government, who had rule over India, in an attempt to free India from British colonial rule. Mahatma Gandhi was eventually successful also, but he called on a higher moral law. The women in Europe and in the United States who fought for women to get the vote and the right to education were jailed and went on hunger strikes. They were eventually successful. They called on a higher moral law in order to succeed in their course. So what all of this should show you is that legality is not morality, and in fact, reformers have called on moral law to change civil law. But there's another problem with depending on legality to determine what your morality is. Let's think about this. You need to vote on laws. It is you who are going to be voting on whether gay marriage is made legal in Hawaii. It is you who are going to be voting on assisted suicide. It is you who are going to be voting on women retain the right to choice in abortion. Now, if you depend on legality to determine your morality, you're going to have to sit around and to see what everybody else votes for before you decide what you're voting on. That doesn't make any sense. You'd have to wait to see what law was passed in order to decide what law to vote for. So obviously, there are problems with depending on civil law to dictate morality. Number one, it leaves us no moral basis to reform existing laws. If you believe that, then you would have to believe the Martin Luther Kings and Henry David Thoreaus and Nelson Mandelas and Mahatma Gandhis are immoral. Secondly, it leaves us no moral basis to create and vote on new laws. So legality is not morality. When asked to make a moral determination in a case or in a controversy in this class, reference to the law is an inadequate answer. Okay, let's look at one more insufficient answer. Now, the Quran is the holy book of the Muslim people. And there are some Muslims who believe that just because the Quran says something, that it is so. That it is moral because the Quran says it is moral, or it is immoral because the Quran says it is immoral. Philosophers do not agree. However, philosophers would also say other insufficient answers are, the Bible says so. The Buddhist sutras say so. The Hindu scriptures say so. All of these are considered insufficient answers. As a matter of fact, an insufficient answer is always God says so. Many people, when asked to make a moral decision, thinks God said so is reason for their moral decision. It is not. This is often very difficult for some of my students to understand. They think that God said so is reason enough. So we're going to look at those ethical theories called divine command theories. Those ethical theories that determine morality or immorality based on God's commands, what God says, in order to see the problem with this. I think after a while you'll begin to see where the problem lies. In order to look at divine command theories, the first thing we have to do is look at the structure of all ethical theories. All ethical theories share basically the same structure. Every ethical theory provides a definition of the good. Every ethical theory also provides a justification for the good. By a justification for the good, we simply mean it answers the question, why be good? It should be very clear that we can know what the good is and decide not to do it. The justification for the good gives us a reason to do the good when we know what the good is. In addition to a definition of the good and a justification for the good, almost all ethical theories will give you a method for determining the good in specific situations. And finally, most ethical theories will provide you with a form of ethical reasoning. Ethical reasoning is the reasoning used to support the above answers. What are the reasons that this is the definition of the good? What are the reasons that this is the justification of the good? What is the reasons that this is the method? So, now that we know the basic structure of all ethical theories, or at least most of them, let's look at the structure of a divine command theory. What is the divine command theory? Well, first, in a divine command theory, the definition of the good is what the divine being commands. If you want to know what good is, determine God's will. Determine what the divine being commands in the situation. Now, the justification of the good. Why be good in a divine command theory? Well, there are many reasons. First of all, desire for divine rewards. Many people are good in a divine command theory because they want to go to heaven, or because they want the gifts that God will bestow on them. Another reason is, of course, fear of divine punishment. Why be good? Because you're afraid you're going to be punished if you're not good. Of course, most truly spiritual people give as their reason for being good in a divine command theory simply love of the divine. And of course, sometimes there is simply just a desire to be good. So these are all reasons, justifications for the good in the divine command theory. So what would be the method for determining the good? How would you know the good in any specific situation? Well, in a divine command theory, determine divine will. And finally, what is the ethical reasoning in a divine command theory? Well, you might realize this is where the problem is, because a lot of divine command theories don't give ethical reasoning. As a matter of fact, the ethical reasoning usually boils down to faith. Okay, now that we know the structure of divine command theory, we can begin to look at the problems with the divine command theory, why it is insufficient to say, God said so. The first flaw in the divine command theory is there is no agreed upon proof that a divine being exists. Now, we saw before there's no definitive answers to philosophical questions, which is a wonderful thing because it gives you the ability to decide for yourself. Well, there is no definitive answer to the question, does God exist? So, if you choose to believe in a divine command theory, you have chosen to believe that God exists. And if you have chosen to believe that God exists, you need reasons for that belief. That is what counts. Not just saying God exists, but why do you believe God exists? Of course, though, even once you decide that you believe there is a divine being, you have to decide which god or goddess to believe in. You see, there are many gods. There are many goddesses. There are many divine beings believed in by people all over the world. If you believe in a divine being, not only why do you believe, but which one do you believe in? And of course, if you've decided to believe in a divine being, and you've decided which divine being, you should have reasons. And you should know those reasons. If you are going to run your life by a belief, you should know your reasons for that belief. But let's say, okay, you've decided to believe in a divine being. You know the divine being you believe in. In order to determine your ethics by a divine being, you have to know what that divine being commands. You have to know God's will or the goddess's will in that situation. So how do you know divine will? Well, a lot of people determine divine will by reference to a book. The books we mentioned before, the Quran, the Bible, the Hindu Vedas, the Buddhist Sutras. But you still have to ask yourself, which book? Some people are going to choose the Hindu Vedas. Some people are going to choose the Buddhist Sutras. Some people are going to choose the Bible. But it's not obvious choice. Some people are going to choose a New Age channel. So if you choose a New Age channel or the Bible or the Vedas or the Sutras or the Qurans, guess who made that choice? You did. And you need reasons for that choice, and you need to know those reasons. But okay, let's assume that you've chosen a book, and let's assume that book is the Bible, just because that is the book most of my students are aware of. Let's say you chose the Bible, and you have reasons for choosing the Bible. Of course, there's only one interpretation of the Bible, right? Of course there isn't. First of all, the Bible was written, the Gospels, let's just take the Gospels. The Gospels were written in Greek. Then they were translated to Latin. Then they've been translated into English and German and Italian. There are all sorts of translations of the Bible. So not only do you have to choose which book, having chosen the Bible, you have to determine which translation. Even there are different English translations of the Bible. So guess who has to choose which translation to use? You do. And you need reasons for that choice. But, okay, let's say that you have chosen your book, the Bible, you have reasons. You've chosen the translation, you have reasons. We, of course, know that. Everybody agrees on the interpretation of every passage in the Bible, right? No, of course they don't. You have to choose which interpretation of the passages that you believe in. The fact of the matter is that people can disagree vehemently over the interpretation of any particular passage in the Bible. An Episcopalian minister and a Southern Baptist can disagree entirely. Any two Christian religions can disagree about the meaning of any particular passage in the Bible. Think about this. Let's choose an obvious example. There are Christian churches that condemn homosexuality. They condemn homosexuality because they say that it is a sin in the Bible. However, there are other Christian churches that have openly gay ministers. They have hired openly gay ministers. How can this happen if they're both reading from the same Bible? Well, they have a different interpretation. You see, yes, homosexuality is condemned in the Bible. And so some churches will say homosexuality is a sin. However, others, those who accept homosexuality now, will point out to the fact that there are many things condemned in the Bible we now accept. And as a matter of fact, there are things approved of in the Bible that we now reject vehemently. For example, usury is condemned in the Bible. What is usury? Usury is lending money for interest. That is a sin in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Of course, usury is the basis of our capitalist economic system. So people say, well, that was true in those times, but now times have changed. Wearing makeup is condemned in the Bible, and yet most women today wear makeup. Eating pig is condemned in the Bible, but people eat pig all the time. Some don't, some do. On the other hand, slavery is approved of in the Bible. There are many passages in the Bible which shows that the Bible approves of slavery. As a matter of fact, those passages were used to support slavery during the Civil War. By those who wanted to continue to own slaves, they published Bible verses to support their position. So which interpretation do you use? Guess who has to decide? You do. How do you decide? You need ethical reasoning. You need reasons for your decision. So, once you decide which book, there is another question you have to ask. You see, some people choose a book, but they never read that book. I know that may seem shocking, but they live their whole lives according to a book they've never read. Now, for these people, they choose a teacher. They choose a teacher to tell them what's in the book, which translation of the book to use, and what the book means. But here's the problem. You still have to decide which teacher. You have to decide, are you going to choose a rabbi, a mullah, a guru, a yogi, a priest, a preacher, a minister? You have to choose the teacher. How do you do that? You need reasoning. Because to tell you the truth, not all preachers are holy. Not all ministers are anointed. Not all gurus are enlightened. As a matter of fact, some of them are just after your money. Some of them are just after power. And they're more than willing to tell you how to live your life for their power. So you better be darn careful when choosing your priest or preacher or minister or guru or channel. Even the Bible says, they shall come to you in sheep's clothing, but inside they shall be as ravening wolves. They shall come to you in sheep's clothing, but inside they shall be as ravening wolves. What does this mean? Basically, this is saying, be careful of false prophets. Be careful of false preachers. This is very good advice because there are many false preachers. Let's take Jim Jones, for instance. Jim Jones was a minister in San Francisco. He had a huge congregation. He eventually decided that his congregation needed to go to Guyana to start a whole new community. His followers followed him to Guyana and built a new community. What they did not know is Jim Jones was a drug addict who experienced long episodes of paranoia. And one day, Jim Jones told them that God was calling them home to heaven. He told them to give their children poison Kool-Aid, to kill them, and then to take the poison Kool-Aid themselves and die, because God was calling them home. Several days later, when the CIA arrived in Guyana, they found 900 dead bodies and crushed Dixie cups. Jim Bakker, the TV evangelist, took hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who had no money, who were sending them 10s and 20s out of his pocket every week. And what did Jim Bakker do with that money? He spent it on limousines and prostitutes and luxuries. Or have you heard of the Heaven's Gate community? The Heaven's Gate community, 39 people killed themselves waiting for a spaceship to beam them up because their religious leaders told them that a spaceship behind Hale-Bopp Comet was come to take them home. And of course, we've learned from the very sad scandals in the Catholic Church that just because someone has a collar doesn't mean you should trust your children with them. So what's the point? If you use a divine command theory and you determine God's will by a teacher, guess who chooses the teacher? You do. And if you choose the teacher, you need reasons. It is the reasons that count. Your reasons for believing God exists, your reasons for choosing which God, your reasons for choosing which book, your reasons for choosing which teacher. But of course, not everybody uses any of those. Some people just use revelation to determine God's will. However, there's a problem with using revelation. Well, what do we mean by revelation? Some people determine God's will by direct communion with the divine. They pray for answers, and they are answered through signs or symbols. In some way, they are communicated with personally by God. In some religions, the appearance of an animal can be thought as an answer to a question. Sometimes if you just happen to open to a book to a specific passage, that is considered an answer. Sometimes a happenstance word from a friend that happens to apply to a question you asked is considered your answer. But in all these cases, whether the answer given is a still small voice within you or the answer is one of these signs or symbols, guess who decides that it's an answer? Guess who interprets what that answer means? You do. You still have to figure out that a sign is a revelation. Think Think about the following situation. Say you go home tonight and an angel appears in your bedroom. Yeah. What would you have to think about? An angel appears in your bedroom to give you divine will. What would you have to think about? Well, the first thing I would ask is, angel, schizophrenia? Either of those could be true. Do you know it's an angel, or perhaps you're having a nervous breakdown? Do you know it's an angel, or perhaps somebody slipped you a drug? And of course, if you believe in angels, maybe you believe in demons. And after all, the devil hath the power to assume a pleasing shape. So how are you going to know that that's an angel? How are you going to decide? That is the problem with revelation. How do you distinguish revelation from delusion? There is a very famous play, one of the most famous plays in English literature, that is about this very subject. The play is called Hamlet by William Shakespeare. Now, one night, Hamlet is on the very opening scene of the play, Hamlet is on the parapet of the castle, strolling with his friend Horatio. Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. It's a foggy night, and the guard, the very first line of the play is, "Who goes there?" That's just like Shakespeare. He lets you know exactly what the theme of the play is from the very beginning. Well, as Hamlet and Horatio are strolling the parapet of the castle, a ghost appears. And it is the ghost of Hamlet's father. And the ghost says, "Your mother and my brother, your uncle, hath killed me and stolen my kingdom." And then the ghost says, Hamlet must revenge his death, and disappears. Well, Hamlet's in quite a problem now, because Hamlet knows that indeed his mother has married his uncle, his father's brother, and they now run the kingdom. But he does not know that what the ghost said is true. As a matter of fact, he's not sure what the ghost was. The first thing he has to ask himself is, am I crazy? Am I going insane? Was that real? Secondly, he has to ask, is this some demon? Because Hamlet believes in demons, and Hamlet thinks, well, this could be some spirit from hell who has come up to make him damn his own soul for all time by taking revenge on his mother. And that is where the line comes from. The devil hath the power to assume a pleasing shape. You see, Hamlet doesn't know what to do. Hamlet doesn't know how to decide whether this is revelation or delusion. And he's actually, for the rest of the play, Hamlet is stuck thinking, how do I know what's true? How do I know what's real? In each of these inadequate answers, you are stuck with that same question. So, each of these questions, if you use a divine command theory, how do you know to have divine will? Which book? Which teacher? How to distinguish revelation from delusion? Well, each of these questions, they require ethical reasoning. Now, for this reason, many philosophy teachers will not allow you to use a divine command theory in class, because it is so flawed in terms of having to have every single one of these questions answered. However, I'm not one of those teachers. If your morality arises out of your spirituality, then use it. But you must give your reasons. Just as if you agree with your parents and you agree with the way you were raised, give your reasons. If you agree with your tradition and you think a tradition needs to be preserved, give your reasons. If you agree with the laws and you decide the laws are moral laws, give your reasons. And if you determine your morality through a divine command theory, give your reasons. Now, in the future, when you are asked to solve moral dilemmas and ethical controversies, should you choose to use a divine command theory, you must answer these questions. If you use any divine command theory in this class, you must use ethical reasoning to answer these questions. How do you know God exists? And how do you know God's will in this situation? If you can provide reasons to answer those questions, then you can use a divine command theory. But God said so is inadequate. And now you should realize why. God said so. The Bible said so. The Quran said so. The Hindu Vedas said so. The Buddhist Sutras said so. Inadequate. And now that should be abundantly clear to you. Now, as you answer these questions, how do you know God exists? Or how do you know God's will? You have to remember, of course, that I was raised that way is not an answer. This is my tradition is not an answer. So when answering, how do you know God exists? And how do you know God's will? Remember, I was raised that way is not an answer. And this is my tradition is not an answer. Now, as you are answering these questions, you're answering these moral dilemmas and ethical controversies, you must be answering from your personal moral theory. You will also be answering from a philosophical ethical theory as we begin to learn these ethical theories. Philosophical ethical theories attempt to give universal answers to moral questions. In other words, for the most part, philosophers are trying to answer the question, what should everyone believe and why should they believe it? They are saying, if it is wrong for one person, it is wrong for everyone. For example, if slavery is wrong for one person, it is wrong for every person. So philosophers are looking to come up with a universal moral theory. For you, when you begin to answer from your own morals, from your own point of view, I am not going to ask you to come up with a universal moral theory. I am not going to ask you to determine what every human being should do. That would be ridiculous. It is hard enough for philosophers to come up with universal moral theories. So I certainly wouldn't expect you to come up with a universal moral theory. What I do expect is that you are able to come up with your moral decisions and you are able to give reasons for that decision. So, for your answers, you do not have to try to say why everyone should believe what you do. As a matter of fact, you should not assume that everyone must believe as you do. So you do not have to try to say why everyone should believe what you do. You must, however, explain why you believe as you do and provide your reasons and experiences. So as we move on and you begin to look at your moral dilemmas and these ethical controversies, we will begin to learn how philosophers throughout time would give their answers to them and what their reasonings would be. As you are developing your reasoning in your ideas, if you happen to be developing a divine command theory, you will realize that those ethical reasons that you give are often very personal and very cultural. Let's look at this. Divine command theory, ethical reasoning. Most often very personal and individual or cultural. For instance, if a student said to me, I believe in this God, and I believe in this church, and I believe in this book because I was broke, I was addicted, I was homeless, I was out on the street. But when I found this God, and I found this church, and I found this book, my life worked out. I was able to put my life back together, and I'm in school now, and I'm off drugs, and I'm taking care of my family. And that's my reason, because this gave me that. That's a reason. That's a reason for that student to believe in his or her divine command theory. It is not a reason for everyone to believe. There are many personal reasons for believing in a divine command theory based on personal experiences, based on your own view of the world and how you have developed it and how you have lived this life. that don't have to come from I was raised that way, that don't have to come from it's my tradition. However, your experiences are your experiences. Because the divine command theories are based on personal experiences, they do not lead to universal theories. However, therefore, divine command theories fail as a theory all can agree on. The problem happens when people who hold a divine command theory believe that their divine command theory is true for all. And the result of this has been thousands of years of religious warfare. The result of this has been millions of people killing and millions of people dying. All because people believe that their divine command theory should be believed in by everyone, even though their reasons for the belief in the divine command theory are personal. So this right here should show you why philosophers believe reasoning is so important. This should give you an indication of why we need to understand why we believe what we do. Not just what we believe, but why we believe what we do. And we need to know the difference between a personal morality and a universal morality. And that is one of the things we'll be looking at. So, next time we are going to begin to learn how to create the best possible answers. Now you know what inadequate answers are. Next time we can look at what are really good answers. So, let's look at the learning objectives for this program. You should be able to explain why I was raised that way is not an answer in moral philosophy. You should be able to explain why tradition is rejected as an ethical theory. You should be able to explain why legality is not morality. You should be able to define moral, immoral, and non-moral. You should be able to outline the basic elements of a moral theory: the definition of the good, justification for the good, the method for determining the good, and the reasoning. You should also be able to describe the elements of the divine command theory: the definition of the good, what God commands is good, the justification for the good, divine rewards, fear of divine punishment, love of God, wanting to be good. You should also be able to describe the method for determining the good and the ethical reasoning, which would be personal. And faith, of course, is not an answer. Also, you should be able to describe the flaws in the divine command theory. Every ethical theory has its flaws. If ethical theories were not flawed, we would have the perfect answer. We would have a definitive answer, and we certainly wouldn't need a class in ethics. So, describe the flaws in the divine command theory. Describe what kind of reasoning a student must provide if he or she employs the divine command theory. And explain why the reasoning used in a divine command theory can only apply to the self. Okay, so make sure you read Chapter 2, Inadequate Answers, in your web chapter. Make sure you answer all of the study questions at the end of that chapter. Email me if you have any questions. And again, make sure you've read your syllabus so you understand all the requirements for this course. If you have any questions in the meantime, I am always available. Phone me or email me or stop by my office.